Hey everybody, Gromos here, and this is going to be the first part of a new little basic air combat tutorial series I'm starting here. With the videos in this series, I hope to be able to provide some insight and help to players new to combat flight simulations like DCS, IL-2, Rise of Flight or similar products. And I hope I can help to improve some things, flying, tactics and so on, and clear up a few misconceptions that might be misleading. Now, this tutorial video, and the ones that I hope will follow it, are meant to provide an insight in air combat basics without you having much prior knowledge of the subject. And of course, it's not meant to be learning material for an aerospace engineer, but for players of military flight simulations as a hobby, so I will not annoy you with mathematical formulas unless there is for some reason really no way around it. But instead, try to explain things detailed, but in a way that is hopefully easy to understand, even if you have no prior experience with air combat simulations. I will mostly use DCS, as it provides the largest amount of planes from different areas. But the principles I will talk about apply to other simulators as well, of course, and I will cover multiple time frames from propeller fighters to jets. So let's get right into it. Now, the most important thing in my opinion about being successful in dogfight or in combat in a simulator is, in my opinion, knowledge. To know your opponent's plane's weak points and try to exploit them, know his plane's strong points to avoid them, and not play right into your opponent's hands, by, for example, trying to turn fighter 0 with a Corsair. And the other way around, of course, to play to your plane's strong points and avoid what your plane is bad at, or worse at than the enemy. And hopefully get your opponent to play by your rules. In order to be able to do so, however, you need to be able to judge what those strong and weak points are as good as possible. Sure, you can at least for some planes find a lot of information on forums, books and other sources telling you this plane turns better than that one, this one has a better energy retention than this one in that situation, and so on. But you won't find details on all planes, and I found that reading that this plane at that speed will turn better than this one, but on a higher speed it's the other way around, is just not the same thing as having a bit of an understanding of why this is the case yourself. Also, there's a lot of either wrong or misinterpreted information out there too, and it helps to be able to spot it. So for that reason, at least some of my tutorial videos, like this first one here, will deal with explaining why certain fighters have certain flight characteristics, and how you can, at least to a certain extent, judge that from the data that is easily available for most planes. This first one will primarily deal with turning. Generally one of the most common questions among players of combat flight simulators, or new to this kind of genre. What plane turns better than another, in what situation and why? There is of course always the question of how important turn rate is in the first place, but this is something about a later, more tactic-orientated video. And will of course also depend a lot on the situation and the time frame the simulation plays in. For example, is it World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and so on. Today we look at the basics though. If we have, for example, a Supermarine Spitfire turning as tight as it can on 400 km/h speed, and a Focke-Wulf 490 behind it tries to follow it into the turn, why does the Focke-Wulf 490 trying to follow is not able to turn as tight and will stall if he tries? Now, first we go over some basic terminology, like wing loading, angle of attack, stall, stall speed, and so on, and what role they play when a fighter turns. Also, what is an instantaneous turn rate and so on, how will this look at high speed, and what influence has your engine power on your turn rate. At first we look at the basics, and then also go quickly over a few wing geometries, like swept wings and delta, and what they bring to the equation. Now then, to start off we will go over what wing loading is, and then what stall and stall speed as well as angle of attack is. Okay, one term you will hear often mentioned when talking about military aircraft or aircraft in general and their flight characteristics and turn rate is wing loading. Now, wing loading simply describes how much load, how much weight every square inch or square meter, depending on your measurement system, of your wing has to carry. As a result, you get wing loading simply by dividing the plane in question's loaded weight by its wing area. To give you an example, this F100 Super Sabre on the screen has a loaded weight of roughly 13,000 kg and a wing area of 37 square meters. 13,000 divided by 37 gives a wing loading of roughly 350 kg per square meter. Every square meter of wing has to lift 350 kg to counter the plane's weight and make it fly. In comparison, a B-51 Mustang has a wing loading of about 210 kg per square meter, and a A6M0 is at about 110 kg per square meter, though that depends in all cases on the exact version of the plane, which have different weights, so make sure you look up the data of the one you are flying. So, the heavier the plane, or the smaller the wing area, the higher the wing loading. How much weight your wing area has to carry is an important factor when it comes to how well a plane can turn, though certainly not the only one, and we will get into why shortly. Now, wing loading is of course not perfectly accurate, as the lift created by said wing area still depends on wing design and other factors. And with more modern jet fighters, you got the fuselage providing a larger and larger percentage of total lift as well. But when comparing planes of the same general time frame, it is generally accurate enough, and especially pre-fly-by-wire and thrust vectoring a good indication of which plane will be the better slow-speed turner. It's also something you can easily get for all planes, as all you need to know is the weight and the wing area. The larger your wing, the more lift, but also more drag, as the air flowing around the aircraft creates friction doing so, drag holding the aircraft back. So, before we go into more detail as to why, one thing I spoiler is, if you have two planes of otherwise similar layout, performance and weight, but a large difference in wing loading, the one with the lower wing loading will generally be the better slow speed turner, while the one with the higher wing loading will often be capable of higher top speeds because of less drag. But again, there are some other factors to consider we will go over. Now, that's a quick explanation of the term wing loading. Let's take a look of what a stall speed and angle of attack are. Three more basic terms that need to be understood in order to understand what happens when a plane turns in a tight circle. Now, in order to do so, I have to quickly go over how a wing works. Now, here we have our wing, and the wing produces lift to cancel out gravity and make the plane fly, and in simple terms, the wing moves through the air, creating airflow around its profile, separating it into two flows above and below the wing, with the top part, thanks to the shape or angle of attack, moving faster than the air passing below, which in turn leads to a low pressure zone above the wing and a high pressure below, creating lift. Now, I won't go into the why in more detail. After all, this is basic air combat and not basic soft flight. So, this is how the wing creates lift, more or less. Now, there are two primary ways for this wing, without changing its shape, to create more lift. One is if the airflow is faster. The faster, the more lift it creates, at least till you reach transonic speeds. The slower, the less lift. So obviously, if you have two planes of the same type and one is flying faster, it creates more lift than one going slower. Now, the second way to increase the lift produced by a wing is angle of attack, the angle at which the wing moves through the air. The higher this angle of attack, the higher the lift the wing creates, but of course the drag created increases as well as the angle of attack increases for multiple reasons. The obvious one being that the increased apparent thickness of the wing hitting the airstream head-on. Another is that the lift created by the wing is of course normal to the wing, so as your angle increases, the lift vector will be tilted backwards more and more, and therefore has a horizontal component that acts as drag. That has to be considered in a fighter design. A fighter with smaller wings, higher wing loading, can go faster because the lower wing area produces less drag. The higher the speed you're aiming at, the more this will matter, as the air resistance rises exponentially with speed. But since the smaller wing obviously also produces less lift, the plane with the smaller wing also needs a higher angle of attack to fly at slower speed than one with a larger wing, leading to the high wing loading fighter with less drag on high speeds to create more drag than a low wing loading one at very low speeds because of the extra drag produced by the high angle of attack. Which is one reason why typical low wing loading turn fighters are usually be able to maneuver and turn more energy efficiently at slow speeds than high wing loading fighter, which in turn will be more energy efficient at higher speed, high speed maneuvers. Like a high speed slashing attack followed by a shallow pull-out and a zoom climb. Also, this influence of speed and angle of attack on the lift the wing produces is also why you generally still talk about wing loading, wing area divided by weight, even today, and not, as I saw suggested in the past on my channel, lift lift-to-weight ratio, because that supposedly would be more accurate. Since the lift is however depending on the angle of attack and speed, and different wing shapes and profiles don't all react the same to angle of attack and speed changes, you would have, in order to compare two planes properly, do so at all speeds and angle of attacks. So unless you have a very large amount of very accurate data about the planes in question, which you will generally not have easy access to, and want to do a lot of mathematics on top of that, you are better off using wing loading here like everybody else. After all, you want to fly the fighter, not design one, and the data necessary to get the plane's wing loading you can get for every plane without any problem. Now, with the angle of attack explained, let's talk about what normally is the limiting factor when it comes to slow speed turn rate, when the wing stalls. Though modern thrust vectoring fighters can maneuver post-stall, but those are rare in simulations accurate enough that any of this matters. Now, with this said, if the angle of attack of the wing increases, the lift increases. The higher the angle of attack, the higher the lift, but of course only to a certain point. Eventually, usually around 20 to 25 degrees, that depends on the wing design, the angle of attack gets too high, over the so-called critical angle of attack. And what happens now is that the airflow on the top of the wing will separate from the wing, and now no longer flow over it, and the wing no longer produces lift. Instead of flowing over the wing, the separated airstream creates eddies and vortexes, which in turn create drag. The wing is stalled. At this point, you no longer have a wing, you have an air brake. So, this is what happens when a wing stalls. If the wing's angle of attack gets too high and goes over the critical angle of attack, it is stalled and no longer creates lift. So, what is an aircraft's stall speed then? Now, this term does often lead to confusion among players new to the material, because the name stall speed often results in the assumption that a wing is stalled because the plane flies too slow and the airflow is too slow. This is not the case. Stall is about angle of attack and can occur above and below stall speed. Stall speed is defined as the speed at which the plane in horizontal flight is no longer able to keep up its altitude. If you fly in a straight line and reduce your speed, but you want to stay at the same altitude, you have to increase your angle of attack to counter the loss of lift of the slower speed. Now, stall speed is the speed where you have reached your critical angle of attack and you can no longer increase your angle of attack further without stalling. You either have to speed up, lose altitude, or stall. This is the stall speed, and in maneuvers like, for example, a hammerhead, you can well be slower than your stall speed, still climbing, but not be stalled, because your angle of attack is not high enough to do so. So, with those terms explained, let's take a quick look at some of the forces involved when turning, how this comes all together, and also clear up a few misconceptions. Now, we have to look at some simple physics principles here, which you no doubt are familiar with already, but it is necessary for this video. Let's look at this very simple example. We sit in our P-409 fighter and we start to turn circles around this tower in Vegas. What is involved in getting our plane to actually turn and fly in a circle like this? For simplicity reason, we will look at this in a 2D plane at first. Top-down view of the tower, and we are here. We just arrived and want to start turning circles around this tower. So we are here and we at this point in time have a speed of say 400 km per hour. In the direction we were flying just before we start our turn. We want to go around the tower though, so how does this actually work? We have a large velocity vector that way, not around the tower. How do we get it to point in the direction we want to go instead? An explanation that often comes up here is simple. We pull on a stick, now our nose is pointing in the new direction we want to go in, and our engine is now pulling us in that new direction and we turn. This I mentioned because I actually have seen this explanation in simulator forums once or twice, usually connected to the claim that turning is all about the engine, pulling the plane through the turn, and therefore the plane with the highest horsepower should turn the best. Now, one could ask, if turning is all about the engine pulling you through the turn, how does a glider turn? In any case, this explanation is of course incorrect, though engine power does play a role, and we will go over that later. Now, at this point we have pulled back at the stick, but we still have a velocity vector from our 400 kph in the original direction, and that one is not going away on its own. Air resistance alone won't do it. It would take forever for air resistance alone to stop that 400 kph. while in the new direction we currently have a velocity vector of almost 0. We have to accelerate in a new direction first, which is also not instantaneous. Even waiting a bit for some speed to build up in the new direction, we still have a velocity vector of 400 kph in the original direction. If we add those two vectors together, we still end up out here. And yes, the vector towards the turn increases slowly as we accelerate, so it would be a little bit more of a curve, but nowhere near enough to what we need to turn a tight high G circle around this tower, or in a turn fight it would be more a very wide oval. What we need is a force that is big enough to counter our existing velocity vector and pulls us towards the center of the circle, and forces our plane into a turn around the tower. That is true for all moving objects turning around or orbiting something. A force of sufficient power is required to force that object into the orbit, and this force is generally called the centripetal force. For a planet orbiting the Sun, that's gravity. For a stone on a string, that's the string. And for our fighter, this is of course the lift from the wings. Because in such a highly banked turn, our lift created by our wings is of course pointing sideways into the turn, not upwards like it would be in level flight. So we are also losing altitude in such a highly banked turn if we don't counter that with the rudder or reducing the bank, but let's focus on the turn for now. That one, unlike the speed we get from the engine, is in the new direction and does not have to build up, it's already there, instantaneous. So let's add the lift from our plane to the picture as a vector. And when we add that vector to our velocity vector, we get one pointing in about the direction we want to go. And of course, as we move along the circle and keep pulling on the stick to keep the angle of attack up, the vector of course continuously changes, and we move in a circle around the tower. And this is how we turn, and of course also the reason why low wing loading planes can turn tighter at slower speeds, because you need the lift from the wings to counter your plane's inertia in the original direction. The more lift you can create, the tighter you can turn. The tighter you turn, the more G-forces you are pulling, and the more lift you need in order to stay in the turn. In order for a Focke-Wulf 490 with its smaller wings to create the same amount of lift as a Spitfire with its larger wings at those 400 kph we have in this example, it needs a higher angle of attack, so it will go over the critical angle of attack and stall before the Spitfire does. Now, as you can see, thanks to our angle of attack, our lift vector is not pointing just straight at the center of our turn, but a bit behind. Because as mentioned before, a part of the vector is drag, that which also slows us down. Turning costs energy, speed. The higher angle of attack, the more energy you need, and the more speed you are most likely to lose in a turn. This of course also means that again, the plane with the higher wing loading generally will need more energy to perform the same turn at those lower speeds, as it needs a higher angle of attack to do so. Now, so far we have talked about the instantaneous turn rate at this speed. How sharp can we turn right now? As you keep turning, parameters like speed change of course, so the sustained turn circle is not the same as the instantaneous one. I have to say right here though that in your average turn fight, the traditional definition of a sustained turn, the turn you can keep up without losing altitude and further energy, is next to useless for us here. It's a classroom definition and nice to know if you want to know how tight you can make an orbit around an airfield while waiting to get landing clearance. But in a turn fight you will generally have little use for continuous turns so shallow that you don't lose energy. When we talk about energy fighting later, maybe, but in a turn fight, no. So we are looking at a sustained turn that is constantly changing as your speed and energy level changes, and in a turn fight usually gets lower. Anyway, of course turning costs you speed, slows your plane down. As you slow down, you will require a higher angle of attack to keep turning. If you hoped I will tell you here that the Focke-Wulf 490 has the edge over the Spitfire this time, I have to disappoint you. The Focke-Wulf 490 with its higher wing loading has to use a higher angle of attack to begin with, which creates drag, so it will also lose energy speed faster than the Spitfire, turning at the same rate. The Spitfire of course has more room to turn, even tighter than the Focke-Wulf 490, also going to its angle of attack limit, in which case the Focke-Wulf 490 will be more energy efficient, but the Spitfire will turn much tighter too. If the pilot of the Spitfire wants, he can turn just slightly tighter than the Focke-Wulf 490 and do so more energy efficient because of the lower angle of attack. That is at lower speeds though. In general, in slow-speed turning contests, the plane with the lower wing loading has the upper hand, both in instantaneous as well as sustained turns. But there is one more element to this we have not talked about yet, and that is engine power. You lose speed during turning, reducing your lift and increasing the angle of attack needed to keep up the turn. So if you have the engine power to keep your speed from dropping too fast, you can stay maneuverable for longer. So, if you have two identical fighters, but one has more horsepower than the other, they will both have the same instantaneous turn rate, if they start at the same speed, but the one with more horsepower will have the better sustained turn rate as he can keep the speed up longer. A well-known concept, but here are also a few misconceptions I saw on forums a few times. Specifically, what I have read on both forums and comments on my channel a few times is the idea that because higher horsepower helps you to keep your speed up, the plane with the higher horsepower should always be the better in sustained turns, and because of this, planes like the F4U Corsair and F6F Hellcat with their 2000 plus horsepower engines should beat a A6M0, which has less than half that horsepower in a sustained turn fight, because the extra horsepower lets the Corsair and Hellcats keep the speed up better in a turn fight. And all those flight model programmers making it look differently and US Navy pilots living by the mantra "you don't turn with a zero" are all wrong. Well, they were not, of course. We have two big mistakes with that argument. First, it neglects the fact that the much heavier Corsairs and Hellcats have to pull a much higher angle of attack for the same turn than the lighter Zero and lose more energy to begin with in a turning contest. But much more importantly, this idea interprets the importance of engine power for turn rate wrong. It assumes just the higher number of horsepower is what counts, and this is not the case here. High horsepower, or thrust if we talk about jets, is important for a high top speed, of course, specifically the ratio from horsepower or thrust to drag. Weight also plays a role. A heavier plane needs a higher angle of attack, but not so much as for a car, for example. So when it comes to top speed, the much higher engine power of a Hellcat or Corsair compared to a Zero is what matters, and results in a significantly higher top speed for the US planes, making them the much superior fighters in a World War II environment, by the way. However, if we are talking about a turn fight, a sustained turn fight, who's got more horsepower alone is not a deciding factor anymore, because a turn needs consistent energy input. You are consistently accelerating in a new direction, so what counts here is not your top speed, it's your acceleration. So, especially at lower speeds where drag is less of a factor than on higher speeds and where sustained turn fights will generally end up at, your total horsepower is not what counts, but your power to weight ratio. And a Zero might have only half the horsepower of a Hellcat, but it is also less than half as heavy, so the power to weight ratio actually favors the Zero, despite it having just 1000 horsepower versus the Hellcat's 2000. So in a sustained turn fight, the Zero still has the upper hand, and the slower the fight gets, as it always will if you keep turning, the more of an advantage the Zero will get. This, I think, does not come as a surprise to most. The ability of the Zero as a turn fighter are well known, but I hope this helps clear up the why a bit more. Well then, so far we have talked about relatively low speed turn fights, so what happens at high speeds? To bring out the Hellcat in Zero again, or Focke-Wulf 19 Spitfire, you will often hear that while on slow speed the lighter Zeros and Spitfires will turn better, at higher speeds it is different, and the heavier Hellcats and Focke-Wulf 90s have the upper hand in instantaneous turn rate over their lighter opponents. And this is indeed the case. So let's talk about why quickly, and also about a further misconception you often run into here. Now, first of all, the same aerodynamical rules about wing loading and angle of attack still apply. So why do the typical lightweight turn fighters here often, though not always, have a disadvantage? Well, simply because at higher speeds you will run into other limitations before you even reach the critical angle of attack. Purely in theory, the turn fighter could still turn tighter, as they create more lift at the same angle of attack, as they did before. But now when we say dive at 700 to 800 kph in a World War II fighter like this, you will run into the limitations of pilot and machine before you can take advantage of this. At those speeds, at maximum angles of attack, the g-forces would be too high for the pilot or plane to withstand. So that is one reason. More importantly, the typical lightweight turn fighter, or just lightweight design in general, and not specifically considered good turn fighters like the Bf 109, have, because of their lighter build, generally problems with high control forces at high speeds, more so than more rugged heavier designs. As an example, here we are in a dive with our Focke-Wulf 190 at a decently fast speed, though not too fast, and if we pull back on the stick fully, I still have enough elevator authority to get over the critical angle of attack and stall the plane almost immediately, meaning I have a pretty decent instantaneous turn rate here. I can get to the angle of attack limit of the plane, though I have to be careful not to pull too hard to stall the plane, but when I do so I can turn pretty tight here at first. Now, if we take a look at the BF109K instead, a very lightweight design that is known for very high control forces at high speeds, I again just pull my stick fully back, and even though I wasn't even as fast as in the Focke-Wulf 190, you can see that the angle of attack builds up very slowly. The reason is simply that the control forces get so high in this plane at high speeds that the pilot in the plane can hardly move the stick anymore and therefore also barely turn. I don't even have to worry about stalling at the high speed turn because I can't pull the necessary angle of attack to do so. So as you can see, the higher wing loading Focke-Wulf 190, while inferior in a low speed turning contest, can turn tighter at high speeds than the lighter BF109, that is instantaneous turn rate of course. And that leads us to our next little misconception. This one I often heard on TV documentaries and also books written by historians that don't really know anything about aviation. And that is the claim that fast and heavy fighters like Hellcat can indeed turn with a Zero or Focke-Wulf 190 with a Spitfire as long as they stay at high enough speeds. Well, the problem with that is pretty simple. You can't. Unless you just happen to turn fight in a 90-degree dive, you can't keep your speed up that high in a turn fight. Let's take a look at an example in the Focke-Wulf 190. We are at the decently high speed here and go to full throttle, and then I turn my MW50 injection on as well for full power. And let's do a 360-degree turn and see what happens to our speed. Now, as you can see, we don't even make it to 90 degrees before we would be down to a speed where a Spitfire would turn better again, and after a full 360-degree turn, we are way out of the Focke-Wulf 190's comfort zone. So yes, at high speeds your instantaneous turn rate is tighter, and you can use this for quick advantage, but taking full advantage of that will cost you a lot of energy and speed and put you right back at the speed where the turn specialists are going to have the better turn rate again. If you do keep your speed up in the plane like a Focke-Wulf 190 and a Corsair, like you should, you're not turn fighting, you are energy fighting, and that's for a different video. Well, that was a basic overview on why one plane turns better or worse than another. To round things out, just a quick word or two on some wing shapes. Now I won't go into much detail here, but just some basics. A thicker wing profile will, as one may expect, generally produce more lift and can handle a higher angle of attack than a thinner one, which in turn creates less drag. So you will usually find thinner wings if the plane was meant to go fast. One example where you see those two on similar planes is the Hawker Typhoon and Hawker Tempest, with the earlier Typhoons having a very thick wing profile, making the Typhoon a decent turner and giving it low stall speeds, but reducing its top speed, especially in a dive. While the Tempest has a thinner wing, making it a slightly worse turner at slow speeds and giving it a higher stall speed, but also making the plane a lot faster. Now, with jets you will start to see swept wings. The point being that when you get close to transonic speeds, the speed around the speed of sound, some airflows over parts of your plane will be faster than the plane itself. For example, the airflow over the top side of your wings, making the airflow go over the speed of sound before the plane itself does. And the shock waves from that, among some other problems, create a lot of drag and reduce the plane's lift. Reducing the top speed the plane can achieve, so in order to be able to go faster, before running into those adverse effects, the swept wing was introduced, which thanks to its wing sweep reduces the effective velocity of the air over the wings, delaying the airflow from reaching transonic speeds. On the downside, that reduced effective airflow speed will reduce lift as well, so on lower speeds the plane has to fly on higher angles of attack, like it would if it would have a higher wing loading than it does. So, as always, swept wings are better to go fast, but worse for tight turning. But usually, as long as the level of technology is similar, you will find similar wing geometries. In World War II you find straight wings, with the exceptions of jet and rocket planes, which are in a different league in any case. So the wing loading of the planes are mostly comparable, while over Korea you find very similar wing sweeps on the main opponents MiG-15 and F-86 Sabre, again making the wing loading comparable. Now, one problem with swept wings as the angle of the wing sweep increases, and one of the reasons why I don't see traditional swept wings like on the Sabre or MiG-15 anymore these days on military fighters, is that on those wings the effective angle of attack on the wingtips is higher than in the middle of the wing. That means as you reach your critical angle of attack, the wingtips will go over that critical angle and stall before the rest of the wing does. Now, on straight wings that would not be such a problem, and on the wing with a less dramatic sweep it's not that big of a problem neither. But as the wing sweep increased in earlier supersonic designs like the F-100 Super Sabre, this becomes an issue. Because thanks to the sweep, the wingtips are far behind the plane's center of lift. If the wingtips stall, the center of lift shifts forward and pushes the nose up, increasing the angle of attack even more and making the rest of the wings stall too. A number of planes were lost to this phenomenon, and they became known as the Sabre dance. Variable geometry wings like on the F-14 and MiG-23 or Tornado are of course designed in an attempt to get the best of both worlds, but at the cost of weight, as the complex wing sweep mechanism is not light and needs a lot of space. A further wing design you see in modern jet fighter designs like the Mirage 2000 is the delta wing, which is well suited for supersonic flight and also thanks to the way it creates lift via a vortex created by the wing's leading edge, able to go to very high angles of attack. That gives the delta wing planes a good instantaneous turn rate, even at slow speeds, as the delta wing can pull a very high angle of attack. That also makes the delta wing design hard to stall. However, the delta wing also needs a higher angle of attack in order to create the same amount of lift than a more traditional wing design. So it also produces more drag at low speeds. As a result, delta-winged planes usually are good turners, but they will bleed speed and energy fast in a turn. So, that is just a quick overview of some wing designs. There are of course many more variations, but for this video I want to focus on the basics and just give a quick overview of what kind of differences to those basics you can expect from different wing shapes. And that brings us to the end of this little tutorial. I hope it was informative, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.